Okay, so this is how we're going to we're going to cover the material on the bureaucracy. It's chapter 15. It's in your textbook, but you're not required to read it. I'm going to cover the information well enough that you'll be fine on the AP exam. But we want to make sure we cover some of the basics here. It'll be just like basically me being in class, except I'm down at Wisconsin Dells at a conference. But we pretty much know how everybody's going to react to it. So I know that right now Carter probably has his hand up, that Myron probably rolled her eyes at that joke, and that in about 3 minutes or so, Brenna will walk into the classroom. So let's take a look at the bureaucracy here. Um, let's go through the first slide. What is a bureaucracy? Basically, Congress and the president, they create all these laws, but they're also times very vague, and it's up to the government officials to figure out how to implement them and how to run them, and regulations and rules and forms and everything else that you need to have. So when you go to the DMV, that'll happen someday, Carter. When you go to the DMV, you're going to basically, be talking to a bureaucrat, somebody behind the desk, or somebody who's taking you on the test drive, or somebody has you fill out a form and you stand in line and you submit it and they take your picture. The person at City Hall behind the desk, or the person who works for the water department or for the recycling center in your local township. These are all parts of bureaucracy here. It's the way that we basically have government organized and implement the rules and laws in our society. Now, bureaucratic bashing has become like a national pastime. Everybody loves to rip on bureaucrats and on bureaucracies, including members of Congress, which is pretty ironic when you consider that their approval rating is around 18%. They still like to rip on bureaucrats. And because of that bashing, there has developed a number of myths about bureaucracies. The first is that Americans dislike bureaucrats, the people who work in the bureaucracy. And that's, according to surveys and studies, is completely untrue. Most people show that they are very pleased with the service they receive. 66% give them the bureaucrats they work with a very high rating. They said they were helpful and courteous and fair. 66%, 2/3, much higher than Congress's approval rating. Another myth that we have is that bureaucracies are growing, that there are more and more bureaucrats, and this is actually only about half true. The number of government employees in all are growing, but most of that growth is happening at the state and the local level, not at the federal level. The federal level has stayed pretty much the same for about the last 20 years. It's the states and the local governments that have significantly increased. There's about 20 million federal employees at the state and local level, about 2.8 million at the federal level. Third myth is that most of the bureaucrats work in Washington, D.C., not in your state to help you. And that's simply not true. Only 1 out of 5, 20%, basically works in Washington, D.C. The rest works within your state. For example, Wisconsin itself has 14,000 federal employees working within the state of Wisconsin. And our last myth that we'll look at is that bureaucrats and bureaucracies are ineffective, that they're inefficient, that they have so much red tape that it's impossible to get anything done. Well, this is not anything new to just government. All organizations have bureaucracies. It doesn't matter if it's a company or if it's a youth organization or a religious organization. It doesn't matter if it's GMC, the Boy Scouts of America, or the Catholic Church. They all use a bureaucracy. It's just a way for us to have an organization for people who work together to accomplish a goal. Okay, I think of bureaucracies and bureaucrats are kind of like referees in a game. If they're doing their job, you don't notice it well. You don't notice them at all. If they do a job poorly, that's when people notice. All right, so let's look at the bureaucrats. This is the bureaucrats, the people who work inside the bureaucracies. The surprising to most people is that the majority of bureaucrats actually work for one of 3 federal government departments. They work for the Department of Defense. Now, this is not including soldiers. This is only civilian workers. They make up 25% of the federal employees. 28% is made up of postal workers working for the U.S. postal system. And then about another 10% work for Veterans Affairs, and that number is significantly increasing because the number of veterans are increasing. Those, that makes up basically 2/3 of all federal employees in just those 3 branches, 3 departments. So, how does one become a bureaucrat? Well, the times have changed. In the past, we had a system called patronage. You would get a job based on political reasons, not based on your talents or your gifts or your merit. You would get promotions based on who you knew, not what you know. Now, to become a federal employee, you have to go through a civil service exam. You enter into the civil service system. It's a pretty intensive exam, and then you are promoted based on how well you do your job. Some bureaucrats are political appointments. These are individuals who basically are filled into a position, and they're picked by the President of the United States. Each president gets to appoint about 3,000 people into the bureaucracy. And that could be anybody from the highest levels, like Hillary Clinton, as we see in this picture here, being chosen by the President of the United States for Secretary of State. These are individuals that we call in and outs. They basically serve under the pleasure of the President. So as long as the President is in office, they hold that job. If somebody else new comes in, somebody else gets appointed. There's about 500 top-level positions that the President appoints and about 2,500 lower-level positions that the President also appoints, but we usually don't know who those individuals are, just because we don't care enough. And if you had to guess which organization of the government, of the federal government, has the largest number of civilian employees, it's actually the military. It's the Department of Defense and some of the other ones that are attached to it. They hire millions of civilians to work for the Department of Defense. The idea of a soldier peeling potatoes and working at the KP just doesn't exist anymore. They don't use them for that anymore. So let's take a look at how bureaucracies are organized. Let's start at the very, very top. We'll start with our cabinet departments and our cabinet positions. Once again, we have our picture of our dysfunctional family, President Obama and Vice President Biden in the middle there. And there are 15 cabinet positions. Each one of them is led by a secretary. So Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Interior, Secretary of Energy, Secretary of Education, and so on. The one exception is the Department of Justice. The person who is in charge of the Department of Justice is not called the Secretary of Justice, but given the title Attorney General. We also have regulatory agencies. So you got cabinet departments and you got regulatory agencies. These agencies, these bureaucrats, basically their job is to make sure that the regulations are enforced, and they're usually designed to protect public interest. It might be like the picture example here of the FCC, which makes sure that the content being played on the radio and on the television is appropriate for viewers of specific ages. They're the ones who give the TV shows their ratings and so forth, and if it's a higher rating, you might be on later at night. They also regulate things like food and drugs. So the food that you eat is actually inspected to make sure that it's safe and not full of contaminants, and the drugs that you might take, prescription drugs, of course, are drugs that have been tested. They know they're not going to have long-term harmful effects, and that any side effects that they may possibly have is going to be clearly labeled before you consume it. So we got cabinet departments, regulatory agencies, and the next one are government corporations. These are kind of like what they sound. They're bureaucracies that are supposed to run like their own company. Okay, so Amtrak and the United States Postal Service are two examples of government corporations. Fortunately, they're not great examples because these are two individual companies here, government companies that do not make money. Amtrak and the Postal Service loses money every single year. And so there's been a lot of talk, especially about the Postal Service lately, about what we should do about it. If we look at it, they charge 45 cents for me to mail a letter from Wisconsin, and they'll deliver it to California for 45 cents. Or it'll be 45 cents for them to deliver it from my house to Kaukauna. Doesn't matter. Still 45 cents. Not a very effective way of doing it. And of course, there's something called email, so the mail has declined significantly. So there's lots of talks of doing things like taking the Postal Service and moving it, changing it, altering it, getting rid of some of the post offices that we have, or maybe not having delivery on Saturdays to try to make it more efficient, more cost-effective. The last one we're going to look at how bureaucracies are organized is kind of like a catch-all. Anything that doesn't fall into the ones that we've already talked about are what we call independent agencies. These are very specific agencies. They have a specific goal and task in mind, My example I have on the slide is NASA. NASA is designed for space exploration. That's what they do, and it's what they're good at. All right, now, sometimes bureaucracies do not work. So why do they fail? Well, there's a number of possible reasons for them. One reason they might fail is because their goal, their task that they were assigned to do is impossible. It just can't be done. Another reason might be because there's a lack of clarity when it comes to the law that Congress created. It's so vague that nobody seems to know exactly what Congress meant by the law. There's a great example of this in your textbook on page 445. You should take a minute right now and you should read it. Oh wait, you can pause the tape, read page 445, the little box section that looks at drug offenders and student loans. It should be interesting to you. Hopefully you paused this and you've read it, and you see that Congress basically had this law that said if you got charged with even a minor drug offense, you're ineligible for student loans, which means you have almost no chance of going to college in this day and age. That's a pretty harsh penalty, especially when you realize that if you committed a murder or a rape or an aggravated assault or a breaking and entering, and you served your time, you would be eligible for those loans. Somebody who's in possession of marijuana wouldn't be. So they wanted to change and alter those laws a little bit, and there has been some changes, although a drug charge can pretty much guarantee that you're not going to get a student loan yet. We also have a lack of resources. Some bureaucracies just are doomed to fail because they don't have enough staff, they don't have a big enough budget to accomplish what they were set out to do. Sometimes bureaucracies fail just because they get kind of stuck in a rut. They know how to do one thing really, really well, but when something happens that's out of the ordinary, that basically takes them by surprise, their standard operating procedure, SOP, their standard operating procedure just doesn't allow them to be sufficient and to expedite these situations. So the last reason why they might sometimes fail is called fragmentation. There are sometimes too many bureaucracies trying to regulate one thing. The book gives a number of examples of this. One of them is the welfare system. There are 10 different departments that all try to regulate welfare. There's over 30 different departments that regulate food, for example, from food being shipped in from other countries to food produced here in the United States. So sometimes those regulations overlap so much that they basically can't get anything accomplished. And sometimes those regulations, they think one department's doing it and another thinks the other department's doing it, and it falls in the crack. So, all right, that is the chapter of bureaucracy in less than 15 minutes. Now, any questions that you might have, Carter? You can either Google them or you can wait till Thursday, and we'll take a quick discussion about this when I come back. We'll finish up the last of our unit on the executive branch and make sure you're prepared for the exam on Friday. We're also going to bump West Wing Friday up to West Wing Thursday this week, where we have a good episode that looks at the filibuster. I think you'll like this episode a lot. See you on Thursday.